continues.
Our next guest is Rob Woodall. He's a representative Republican from Georgia. He is a member of the Budget Committee and here to talk about tax reform. One of the things going along with this idea of what the Republicans are proposing and what it does for the deficit. How do you change the tax structure and not blow up the deficit?
The economic growth is the only opportunity to get rid of the deficit, Pedro. You see a budget that comes out of the Budget Committee this year. We balanced the budget in 10 years. We're the only folks in town talking about balancing the budget in 10 years. And even that runs up about $3 trillion worth of deficits over that 10-year window until we get to balance. If we can talk about increasing economic growth, getting north of 3% in terms of GDP growth, we're going to talk about increased tax revenues coming in. You can't pay income taxes unless you're making an income. We've got to get folks here in this workforce participation rate that has been so discouragingly low over the past few years. Get folks back into the workforce. The more money the American people are making, the more money American families have, the more money they can pay in taxes. That's going to be the answer to deficit reduction long term.
You talked about the House proposal. The Senate proposal, I think, will increase about $1.5 trillion to the deficit. How do you reconcile your two plans then?
Well, my hope is that we'll see that plan come out of the Senate. We'll go to conference, and in fact, we will reconcile those two plans. The House has been a little more optimistic about the things we can do, and I think for good reason. The House has been very successful. I think we have close to 300 bills sitting in the Senate now that we've passed in a bipartisan way, about 80% of those in a bipartisan way, waiting on Senate action. Senate is not as optimistic about those number of programs they'll be able to curtail. I hope we'll come closer to the House position in a conference than the Senate position. But candidly, we just have to come to an agreement to unlock this pathway to tax reform. If I can get 80% of what I want, I'm going to call that a good day.
What you're thinking on then things that go along the actual numbers, things like mortgage interest deductions, state and local taxes. Some people concerned about having those go by the wayside. First of all, what's your position on keeping those or getting rid of those?
Well, I think everything that's in the tax code got there for a reason. Is it a good idea to have folks involved in communities, committed to their community? Is it a good idea to let folks plan for their retirement through the home that they've made with their family? Of course it is, and we're going to want to keep doing that. Is there a reason that we've decided to deduct state and local taxes? Well, of course there is. You've already paid the tax once. Why should you have to pay it again? But is there a flip side to each one of those conversations? Of course there is. We're subsidizing high tax jurisdictions at the expense of low tax jurisdictions. At the end of the day, we have an opportunity for once in a generation tax reform. We're talking about taking America from being the least competitive tax code in the world to one of the most competitive tax codes in the world. That's the big deal for me. I think everything else is going to be a negotiation in terms of how do we get to the votes. I think the votes are around protecting the home mortgage interest deduction. I think the votes are around reducing the number of other exclusions that are in the code. But we're going to have to count those votes one by one, and we're going to have to hear from the American people on where they are.
But keep those things, then you're going to have to change the plan as far as how the deficit is affected.
I don't think that's where we're going to end up. I think that there are enough moving pieces there that we're going to be able to come together around a revenue neutral plan. Again, I know my folks in the Senate are not quite as optimistic as I am, but I care about deficits. I came here around deficits. I'm proud of the budget discipline we've seen over the 6 years that I've been in Congress. Can we cut our way into prosperity? No. But does budget discipline have to be a part of the economic growth that goes to eliminate deficits? Yes, it does.
Well, Rob Woodall, our guest, to talk about tax reforms and the efforts that are being made by Republicans in the House and the Senate. 202-748-8001 for Republicans. It's 202-748-8000 for Democrats and Independents. 202-748-8002. If you want to tweet us, you could do so at C-SPAN WJ. What is the potential for Democrats to go along with this?
Well, I'd like to believe that it's high. We talk about reconciliation instructions. That's that procedure that allows us to move something through the Senate with only 50 votes. But the truth is, you don't have to move it through with 50 votes. We've passed reconciliation bills in the past with 60 votes, with 70 votes, even north of 80 votes. Tax reform is good for all America, making America the most competitive tax nation in the world, good for all Americans. So I'm optimistic that we're going to be able to see that. I appreciate the outreach the White House has done to the folks on the Senate side to say, hey, I want you to be at the table when we move through this. Tax reform is not a Republican or Democratic issue. eliminating complexity should be an issue that we can all get together on.
You brought up the White House. The front page of the Washington Times talks about the current back and forth between the president, members of the Senate, Bob Corker particularly. In the long run, what do these fights, as we can describe them, what do they do for long-term issues like getting tax reform done? And how much of a hindrance is it?
Well, I think we have to redefine what we call a fight these days. I think for the president, relationships are a negotiation, and you're up one day and you're down the next. That's been the product of years and years of business success that the president has achieved, and he's brought that to the White House. Candidly, I'm excited about the way we've shaken up the normal flow of Capitol Hill. I think what the American people said in the last election is that normal flow of Capitol Hill isn't getting it done anymore. Maybe it was getting it done 10 years ago. Maybe in the Gingrich-Clinton era, we were getting lots of things done, but not so these days. Let's shake it up. So I don't want to second guess the White House. President's been incredibly successful, in my opinion, in terms of managing those relationships, in terms of finding the right places to apply his attention in order to help the Congress move forward. And I hope he remains very